World War I seems in the popular imagination to be all about mud and barbed wires and trenches on the Western Front. And if people do think about the war at sea, it's U-boats and the Battle of Jutland that spring to mind. But at the beginning of the war, a handful of German raiding ships caused a short-lived but high-impact blow against the Allies. None more so than a lone German cruiser prowling the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. In 3 months, she sunk or captured over 20 Allied merchant ships carrying supplies for the war effort. She launched the first naval attack on India in, well, centuries, and she sank 2 warships in the Battle of Penang. In the end, she was brought to heel by the newly established Australian Navy. This is the story of the SMS Emden, the Swan of the East. Launched at the Imperial Dockyard in Danzig, which at the time was in Germany, in 1908, the Emden was a Bremen-class cruiser, 388 feet in length, with a 42-foot beam. Armed with 2 torpedo tubes and 10 4.1-inch quick-firing guns with a range of up to 7.5 miles, the Emden was capable of a top speed of around 24 knots. Prior to World War I, Germany had a fledgling empire in the Pacific region, and the East Asiatic Fleet was based out of the German concession of Qingdao in northeast China. And it was to this fleet that the Emden was assigned. Painted in the German Navy's tropical colours of a white hull, buff funnels and buff upward works, she was soon dubbed the Swan of the East. Her captain was Karl von Muller, a 40-year-old son of a Prussian army officer. By 1914 he had already been in the Imperial German Navy for 23 years. The Emden was at sea when Captain von Muller received the news that the war had broken out between Germany and Russia on the 2nd of August. War with Britain would follow 2 days later. Within 2 days, the Emden had seized her first of many prizes, a Russian steamer. Actually, it was the very first prize that any German ship captured in the First World War. By the time the jubilant von Muller had arrived back in Qingdao, he was informed by the commander of the East Asiatic Squadron, Admiral von Spee, that the tiny enclave was far too exposed and would have to be abandoned by the Navy. The Admiral decided to sail across the Pacific Ocean, around the tip of South America at Cape Horn, and up the length of the Atlantic in a bid to reach Germany. He fully accepted that the chances of success were slim, but he reasoned that the more Allied ships he kept away from the European theatre of war chasing him, the better. And so it was to prove, as the Royal Navy gave chase across the Pacific before finally cornering his fleet off the Falkland Islands in December 1914. In the meantime, von Muller had persuaded von Spee to allow him to set out on his own journey home in the opposite direction, disrupting Allied shipping as he tried to head home across the Indian Ocean and into the Atlantic via the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of South Africa. Again, rather like von Spee, the captain of the Emden was not overly optimistic of his chances. But on the other hand, in an age before radar and electronic communications, one ship acting alone would be very hard to track down in the vast Indian Ocean, especially if it was in disguise. With its 3 funnels, the Swan of the East was well recognised in Asian waters, so von Muller had a dummy 4th funnel erected. From a distance, the Emden now actually looked like the British cruiser HMS Yarmouth, based out of Hong Kong. On the 14th of August 1914, the Emden, accompanied by a collier, set off on her mission. It was a voyage that was to paralyse Allied shipping in the Indian Ocean and involved the navies of 5 nations trying to track her down. Sailing through the neutral Dutch East Indies, now East Indonesia, the Emden entered the Bay of Bengal on the 5th of September. During the next 5 days, she sank or captured 8 Allied cargo ships. In fact, it was only on the 14th of September that the British authorities were even made aware that the Emden was operating in the Indian Ocean, after the crew of an Italian ship reported that they had been boarded. Panic now seized Allied ships, which refused to put to sea. It's actually estimated that the value of exports from India in the following 2 months fell by nearly 2/3. But worse was to come. On the night of the 23rd of September 1914, the Emden attacked the port of Madras in India. Under the cover of darkness and using the disguise of the 4th funnel, the Emden entered the harbour and from just 3,000 yards she opened fire on the Burma oil refinery. 2 oil storage tanks were completely destroyed while another 3 were damaged. In the space of 35 minutes, firing 130 rounds, the Emden had destroyed 125 million gallons of kerosene oil. Sweeping around the tip of India, he now headed up the west coast to the Lakshadweep Islands, which are sort of north of the Maldives. Back in the 17th century, the notorious pirate Captain Kidd had used these islands as a base, and it is in these waters that the Emden now seized 6 more Allied merchantmen before sailing south. On the 4th of October, just 2 months after the war had started, the Emden arrived off Diego Garcia in the British colony of the Cocos Islands. Nowadays, Diego Garcia is home to a huge US military base, but back in 1914, the atoll was as remote as you could possibly get in the Indian Ocean. So remote, in fact, that the British officials on the island were blissfully unaware that a world war had broken out 2 months earlier. And so it was that they welcomed a ship from, as they thought, a friendly nation. The Emden stayed at Diego Garcia for nearly a week, making repairs, replenishing stocks, and giving the crew some well-earned rest. Fully refreshed and replenished thanks to the obliging local British officials, the Emden finally departed and headed back to the seas around the Lakshadweep Islands. Once more, the hunting grounds of Captain Kidd proved happy hunting grounds for Captain Von Muller as he seized the blue funnel steamer Troilus, carrying a valuable cargo of copper and rubber from Malaya en route for Britain. And then on the 19th of October, the Cardiff-registered Exford, carrying over 5,500 tonnes of quality Welsh coal, a very useful prize for the coal-powered Emden. By now, the Allies had finally got their act together, and a major hunt for the Emden was underway. 4 Royal Navy cruisers, HMS Hampshire, HMS Gloucester, HMS Weymouth and HMS Yarmouth, headed towards the seas off the western tip of India. They were joined by 2 Japanese and 1 Russian cruiser. Meanwhile, 2 more Japanese cruisers and a further Russian cruiser were desperately searching the Bay of Bengal in case he'd slipped through there. All the while, the Australian and New Zealand governments were getting more and more concerned about the safety of the troop ships that were imminently departing for the European war. Whilst Australia had developed a navy in the last 10 years, it had never been in action, and the possibility of the Emden using her guns and torpedoes on troop ships was just too awful to actually think about. Meanwhile, the Emden had given her pursuers the slip once more and had re-entered the Bay of Bengal, sailing eastwards towards the Malay Peninsula. The island of Penang sits just off the west coast of Malaya, and the harbour at Georgetown was full of Allied ships, many of which were refusing to put to sea until they were sure that the Emden was far, far away. But the Emden was a lot closer than they could possibly imagine. But at the same time, what Von Muller didn't know was that one of the ships in the harbour was a Russian cruiser, the Shemshug. The captain of the Shemshug was ashore, supposedly seeing his wife, although some accounts suggest it was actually his mistress. In his absence, no lookouts had been posted and no searchlights had been turned on. Any vigilance the crew might have had was probably nullified by the presence of 60 Chinese prostitutes who were entertaining the sailors on board. The Emden approached the harbour with her 4th funnel in place at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and at 5:15 she hoisted her imperial colours and fired a torpedo at the Russian cruiser from a range of just 700 metres. It hit the Shemshug midships. Quickly turning in the harbour, the Emden made another pass and fired a second torpedo at the Russian. It hit the forward magazine, resulting in a massive explosion, and the Russian cruiser immediately sank in 30 feet of water. Over half of her crew were killed or injured. No one seems to know what happened to the Chinese prostitutes, but we do know what happened to the captain. He was subsequently court-martialed and reduced to the ranks. As the Emden steamed out of the harbour, she met a French torpedo boat returning from patrol, the Mousquet. The Mousquet was no match for the Emden's fast-firing guns and was quickly sunk. Von Muller paused to pick up 33 French survivors. 2 days later, he stopped a British steamer and transferred the Frenchmen to her, having made them all sign a solemn undertaking that they wouldn't fight for the rest of the war. Now turning south, the Emden sailed through the neutral Dutch East Indies once more, passing the island of Krakatoa. Von Muller's next target was the powerful radio transmission station on the remote Cocos or Keeling Islands. At 6 a.m. on the 9th of November, the wireless operator on Direction Island, one of the Keeling Islands, a man by the name of Dover Ferrant, saw a three-funnelled ship appearing on the horizon, heading straight towards his tiny base. For once, Von Muller had not bothered with his disguise, and the wireless operator quickly sent out a message. SOS, Emden here. In one of those strange quirks of fate that makes up history, the convoy carrying those Anzac troops to Europe had finally departed Australia on the 1st of November and was heading across the Indian Ocean, escorted by the Australian naval cruisers Sydney and Melbourne, as well as the Japanese cruiser Ibuku. In fact, unbeknown to Captain Von Muller, he had actually passed ahead of their route by a matter of hours. And I wonder what could have happened had they actually collided. As it was, the convoy was now just 55 miles away, and it was close enough to pick up the SOS message from the Cocos Islands. The Sydney was ordered to turn towards the remote wireless station. HMS Sydney was a Chatham-class light cruiser, built in 1913. Captained by John Glossop, she could travel at 25 knots, faster than the Emden, and her 8 powerful 6-inch guns could outrange the German Raider too. As the Sydney was powering to the rescue, the Emden had weighed anchor off Direction Island and sent a party of sailors ashore under Lieutenant Helmuth von Mucker. The party of 47 men proceeded to demolish the undefended wireless station, taking care in their very chivalrous manner that the mast didn't fall on the nearby tennis court. At 9 a.m, a lookout on the Emden saw smoke on the horizon. The Sydney had arrived. Leaving his party ashore, he raced out to meet HMAS Sydney and opened fire at 20,000 yards, his maximum range. It caught the Sydney by surprise. 15 shells rapidly hit the Australian cruiser, who moved out of range and then returned fire. Like a boxer, the Sydney kept her distance and allowed her superior range of her guns to jab away at the Emden. For the next hour and a half, over 100 shells hit the Emden, destroying 2 of her 3 funnels. But still, the Swan of the East fought on. The Emden now tried to manoeuvre to line up a shot with her torpedoes on the Sydney, but at that critical moment, the Sydney scored a hit, disabling her steering gear. The crew of the Sydney looked on as a huge fire now took hold of the Germans' engine room, and at 11:15, knowing the battle was lost and deciding to save as many of his crew as possible, Von Muller ran the Emden aground on a coral reef on a nearby island. Captain Glossop on the Sydney, seeing that the Emden was going nowhere, broke off the engagement and gave chase to the Raider's collier, which then scuttled itself. By the time the Australian vessel had returned to the Cocos Islands, the crew of the Emden had finished burning all their signal books and throwing the torpedo aiming gears overboard. Glossop was surprised to see that the Imperial German ensign was still flying defiantly on the Emden, and having received no reply to his call to surrender, he reluctantly fired a few more salvos at the stricken Emden, and finally Von Muller struck his colours. Of the Emden's crew of 376, just over 130 had been killed in the action, and a further 65 wounded. HMAS Sydney had suffered just 15 men killed, and a further 40 wounded. Von Muller, who was allowed to retain his sword, and his crew became prisoners of war for the rest of World War I. The Emden, Swan of the East, was no more. But that is not the end of the story. Do you remember the party of sailors who had landed to destroy the wireless station? They'd been left stranded as the Emden went out to battle with HMAS Sydney. Well, that night they made a daring escape from their little island. Led by Lieutenant Helmuth von Mucker, they boarded an old clapped-out 3-masted schooner by the name of the Ayesha. Just 30 metres in length, her wood was rotten, she was leaking, and 3 of her 4 wet freshwater tanks were contaminated. Nevertheless, piling his 50 men into that small boat, they headed off. And 3 weeks later, they arrived in the port of Penang on the island of Sumatra, nearly 800 miles away. As Sumatra was part of the neutral Dutch East Indies, the authorities there gave them 24 hours to replenish and put to sea again. But in that time, the local German consul had arranged for them to rendezvous with an Axis merchant ship, the Shoixing, which they duly did. The ship deposited the men in the Turkish-controlled Yemen, which the Ottoman Turks had joined the German side in the war. And the 32-year-old von Mucker then took his party up the Red Sea by dhow before heading overland towards Jeddah. En route, they were attacked by hundreds of Bedouin tribesmen who had been paid and armed by the British to try and stop them. For 2 days they held the Bedouins off, using hastily dug trenches and even the bodies of dead camels for cover. And eventually the Emir of Mecca came to their rescue. But it was a rescue of kind, because von Muller started to realise that the Emir was in no hurry to get them back to Germany, and sensed that maybe he and his men were pawns in a wider game being played by the Emir. Once more, under the cover of darkness, he sneaked his men onto a dhow, and they sailed up the Red Sea, finally reaching the Hejaz Railway. Their train journey took the Germans to Damascus and to Aleppo, before finally arriving in the Turkish capital, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, on the 23rd of May 1915, over 6 months after the sinking of the Emden. It's an incredible little story to a footnote in First World War history. Von Muller went on to actually become an early supporter of the Nazi Party, but interestingly, upon Hitler's assumption of power, he then denounced Hitler's rearmament policies, and during the war he was actually imprisoned for his denunciations of the war. After World War II, he continued to lobby for peace in Europe. The war hero come pacifist died in Germany in 1957, aged 76. And what of Captain Von Muller and the Emden? Well, Von Muller was sent to a prisoner of war camp in Malta and then to one in England at Sutton Bonington in Nottinghamshire. He was repatriated in October 1918, suffering from malaria that he had contracted on his tropical adventure with the Emden. And he died in 1923, aged 49, from malaria. The Emden remained wrecked on the reef until she was broken up for scrap in the 1950s. Some of her guns, however, are on display in Australia. The story of SMS Emden is just a footnote in that 4-year First World War which cost so many millions of lives. The Emden never made it home, but it did achieve von Muller's other aim, to disrupt the Allied war effort. For 3 months, this lone German cruiser had sailed 35,000 miles and sunk or captured nearly 20 Allied merchant ships, as well as sinking 2 Allied battleships at the Battle of Penang. Exports from India fell during that period by 2/3 as Allied ships refused to put to sea. Even troop convoys were delayed going to Europe. Over a dozen Allied warships from over 5 nations were diverted to hunt for this lone raider in the Indian Ocean. And all the while, von Muller conducted his war with a chivalry that was fast going to disappear in the Great War. Not a single civilian sailor died in his attacks, except in Madras. The final word in this little story, however, must go to HMAS Sydney. The fledgling Australian Navy had never been into action before. By sinking the Emden, the Sydney had done the job required to make the Indian Ocean safe. 6 of her crew were awarded Distinguished Service Medals for their part in the action. At the Battle of Cocos Island, 9th of November 1914, the Sydney showed that the Australian Navy, just like her army, had come of age. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that little story from the First World War, a bit different to my normal videos. What would you like to hear about in the future? Drop me a line in the comments below. I've got an ever-growing list of ideas coming from viewers and subscribers. Loads more videos coming your way soon. But in the meantime, keep safe, and I'll see you very soon.